The night Caleb Whitmore understood the truth about his life, he was standing in his own dining room, watching a woman laugh at something he hadn't said. Margaret Hollis, the daughter of a neighboring cattle baron, the woman his ranch foreman had been quietly lobbying him to court for 2 years, was seated at the far end of his table, cutting her roast with the precise, unhurried movements of someone who had already decided this house belonged to her. She hadn't looked at him directly once during dinner. She looked at the chandelier he'd imported from Denver. She looked at the silver candlesticks. She looked at the landscape painting above the fireplace and asked who the artist was, and when Caleb said he didn't know, that he'd bought it because the colors reminded him of the ridge behind the north pasture at sundown. She smiled the way a person smiles at a child who has said something sweet but not quite intelligent. "You really should find out," she said. "A painting like that has value. You shouldn't hang something on your wall without knowing what it's worth." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the painting. He'd bought it 3 years ago from a traveling peddler for $4 and a bag of oats. He'd hung it himself, alone on a Sunday afternoon, and stood back and felt something in his chest ease just slightly. He didn't know why. He hadn't tried to explain it. Margaret Hollis was still talking, something about an estate sale in Cheyenne, a set of French chairs. And Caleb picked up his fork and set it down again without eating anything. He thought about the dinner 6 months ago, when a cattle broker from Laramie had spent 3 hours telling him stories about men Caleb had never met, in rooms Caleb had never been in, laughing too loudly at his own punchlines and refilling Caleb's glass before it was empty. He thought about the county commissioner who showed up unannounced twice a year and always left with something: a signed letter of support, a donation to some civic project, the promise of Caleb's name on a document somewhere. He thought about his own foreman, Burl, who had worked for him 11 years and still addressed him as Sir, even when they were alone fixing fence wire in a back pasture at 6 in the morning, 2 men in the dirt together, and Caleb had never once figured out how to make that stop. He thought about his mother, who had died when he was 19 and left him this land and this house, and this particular weight of being someone other people needed things from. Margaret laughed again. The foreman's wife, sitting to Caleb's left, laughed in response, slightly delayed, matching the pitch. Caleb stood up from the table. "Excuse me," he said. He walked out through the kitchen, out the back door, across the yard to the barn. He stood in the dark with his horse, a 16-year-old roan gelding named Scratch, who was well past his prime and had a scar on his left shoulder from a wire accident years ago. Scratch turned his head and looked at Caleb without particular interest and went back to his hay. Caleb put his hand on the horse's neck. He stayed there for a long time, long enough that the lights in the house went dark one by one, long enough that the cold came up from the ground through his boot soles. He made his decision standing there in the dark. He didn't make it cleanly or dramatically. He made it the way a person finally admits something they've known for a long time, not with relief, not with certainty, but with the flat, exhausted recognition that there is no other honest option left. He was going to leave. Not the land. Not permanently, not legally. He was going to leave the version of himself that the land had built. He was going to go somewhere no one knew the name Whitmore. He was going to find out whether there was anything left of him once the money and the acreage and the reputation were stripped away. He wasn't sure there was. That uncertainty was the thing that finally moved him. He spent 4 days preparing, which felt both too long and not long enough. He pulled cash from the lockbox in his office, enough to last a working man 3 months if he was careful, not enough to make anyone suspicious. He told Burl he was going to visit a cousin in Nebraska and would be back in the spring. Burl nodded and said, "Yes, sir," and didn't ask a single question, and that somehow made Caleb feel worse than anything Margaret Hollis had said at dinner. He took Scratch. He took a bedroll, a change of clothes, a skinning knife, a short-handled axe, a coffee pot, and a week's worth of dried beans and jerky. He left his good coat hanging on the peg by the door. He rode out before dawn on a Tuesday, when the sky was still black and the only sound was the gelding's breath and the creak of the saddle. He didn't look back at the house. He told himself he wouldn't, and he kept that promise, which was the first promise he'd kept to himself in longer than he could clearly remember. I was 3 weeks and roughly 200 miles east of his own land before he understood what it actually meant to be no one. He'd picked up a name along the way, Cal Marsh, simple enough to remember, far enough from Whitmore that no one would connect them. He'd found work on a cattle operation outside a town called Fenton's Creek, shoveling out stalls and repairing fence line for $1 a day, and meals at the bunkhouse table. The other hands were a rotating collection of men who had all, in one way or another, ended up somewhere they hadn't planned. Nobody asked questions. That was the bunkhouse rule, unspoken but absolute. What Caleb hadn't anticipated was the physical reality of the work. He'd worked his own land, certainly. He wasn't soft, not by a cattle baron standard. But there was a difference between a man who owns the land and occasionally works it, and a man who does nothing but work it, who rises at 4:30 because that is when the work begins and falls into his bunk at 8 because there is no other option, whose body by the end of the first week is making new sounds it had never previously made, whose hands, which he had thought were calloused, which he had pointed to as evidence of his own toughness, crack open at the knuckles in the dry cold and do not heal because there is no time for them to heal. He ate what was put in front of him and was grateful for it. That was new too. He'd never once in his adult life eaten a meal and felt grateful. He'd felt satisfied, occasionally. He'd felt the meal was adequate or inadequate. He'd sent things back to the kitchen when they weren't right. Now, he ate salt pork and boiled potatoes and felt the warmth of the food spread through his chest and understood for the first time in his life what hunger actually meant. The other men didn't like him much at first. He moved wrong, too deliberate, too careful, in the way of a man who was accustomed to being watched. A hand named Devereaux, who had worked cattle from Texas to Montana and had the hands to prove it, looked at Caleb across the bunkhouse one evening and said, without particular malice, "You ever actually worked before, Marsh, or did you just recently decide to try it?" A few men laughed. Caleb looked at his own hands. "Not like this," he said, which was the most honest thing he'd said in years. Devereaux looked at him for a moment, seemed to decide something, and went back to his cards. That was the beginning of something. Not friendship, not yet, but the absence of hostility, which on the frontier among strangers amounted to roughly the same thing. He lasted 6 weeks at Fenton's Creek before the operation folded. The owner, a man named Hargrove, had overextended on stock and couldn't make payroll through the winter. He told the hands on a Friday morning, apologized without quite looking at anyone, and walked back into his house. 3 men left that afternoon. 2 more left by Sunday. Caleb took his final pay, $4 and some change, and rode on. He found work twice more before November arrived, each time shorter term, each time ending for reasons that had nothing to do with him. The pattern was becoming familiar. Show up, prove you're willing to work, watch the operation struggle under the weight of a season that didn't care about a man's plans or debts or good intentions. Pack your bedroll. Ride on. He was in a small town called Mill Haven, sitting on a step outside a dry goods store, eating a cold biscuit he'd bought for a penny, when a man he'd worked beside briefly on a road crew sat down next to him and said, without preamble, "Somebody's going to freeze out here before spring." Caleb chewed his biscuit. Probably. Might be you. Might be. The man, his name was Coles, which was either a first or last name, Caleb had never determined, looked at the sky. "Storm coming. Real one. I can feel it in my leg where a horse stepped on me in '82. Never been wrong yet." "Where are you going?" "Back to my brother's place in Casper. He don't want me there, but he's my brother." Coles stood up, brushed off his pants. "You got people?" Caleb thought of Burl, who had never once asked him how he was doing. He thought of Margaret Hollis and the French chairs. "Not particularly." Then you'd best find some place to winter over," Coles said. "This ain't the country to be proud in." He walked away down the street and Caleb watched him go, and sat there a while longer with his biscuit and his horse, and the particular loneliness of being a man who has taken everything from himself on purpose and is only now beginning to understand what that means. The storm Coles had predicted arrived 11 days later. Caleb was in the high country west of Mill Haven when he felt the weather change. He knew storms. He'd ranched in Wyoming his whole life. He knew what a real winter blow felt like in the air. But knowing a thing intellectually and experiencing it without shelter, without a warm barn to retreat to, without the ability to simply ride home, were entirely different. He'd been trying to reach a settlement another hand had mentioned, a cluster of homesteads in a valley called Dunmore's Flat that might have work through the winter. He was close, by his reckoning, maybe half a day's ride. He pushed on. The snow started mid-afternoon, light at first, the kind of snow that looks harmless and accumulates. Within an hour, it was not light. Within 2 hours, he could barely see the horse's ears. Scratch was tired. The gelding had been a fine horse in his day and still had good instincts, but 16 years was 16 years, and the cold settled into old joints. He was laboring in the deepening snow, picking his way down a slope that Caleb could no longer clearly see. Caleb should have stopped. He knew, in the rational part of his mind, that stopping and sheltering was the correct decision. But there was no shelter here, and the cold was the kind of cold that doesn't leave room for being still, and so he kept moving because moving was the only option that still felt like doing something. He didn't feel the ground until he was already on it. Later, he understood that Scratch had stepped into a ditch hidden under the snow, a dry stream bed probably, running along the base of a ridge, and had gone down on one knee, in the fall. Caleb had gone sideways, his left boot catching in the stirrup for a half-second before releasing, and he'd hit the slope and slid some distance before a boulder or a deadfall log or something solid stopped him. He lay still for a moment. His first clear thought was that he couldn't feel his left hand. His second thought was that the storm was loud, much louder from down here, from the ground, than it had been from the saddle. He pushed himself up. His left shoulder sent a message to his brain that the brain chose not to immediately interpret. He got to his knees. He looked around for Scratch and couldn't see him. He called out the horse's name, then a whistle, and heard nothing but wind. He was alone on a frozen hillside in a whiteout with one hand not working correctly and a shoulder that was informing him, now, that whatever message it had been sending was something he needed to pay attention to. He made it perhaps 100 yards further down the slope before he couldn't make it any further. He found what shelter there was, a dip in the ground, a slight windbreak from a stand of bare aspens, and got himself into it and pulled his coat around himself and understood, with the flat clarity of a man who has run out of options, that this was going to come down to very simple things. Whether someone found him, whether the temperature dropped another 10 degrees or held, whether his body had enough left in it to last until one of those things happened. He'd left a fortune, he'd left an empire, he'd left a dining room where a woman was discussing French chairs. And now he was lying in a snowbank in a valley he didn't know, and the wind was taking the heat from him steadily. And the last thing he thought before his thinking became unreliable was that this was, in the most absolute sense, what he had asked for. He had wanted to know what remained when everything was stripped away. He was about to find out. He heard voices before he could see anything. A woman's voice, sharp and direct, giving instructions to someone else. A younger voice, a child, saying something back that he couldn't resolve into words. Then something that might have been a rope or a harness, the sound of it being moved, and then hands on him, actual hands through his coat, turning him, checking things in the efficient, matter-of-fact way of a person who doesn't have time to be distressed about what they're finding. He's breathing. The woman's voice again, close now. Get the blanket out of the left saddlebag, the wool one, not the canvas. Mama, is he? He's breathing. Go. Caleb tried to open his eyes. He got them partway. He saw a sky that was white-gray and a face above him that was half in shadow, but what registered, the thing his half-frozen brain held on to, was the expression. Not alarm, not pity, not the performative concern of someone who has not yet decided what to do. Just concentration. The face of a person assessing a problem and working through it methodically because there is no one else to do it. Can you hear me? The woman said. Yes, Caleb said. It came out wrong. Too quiet, too unformed. He tried again. Yes. Good. I need you to help me get you onto my horse. I can't lift you alone. Do you understand? He understood. He tried to tell his body to cooperate. His body had complicated opinions about this plan. Together, the woman pulling, Caleb doing something that did not quite constitute helping but was at least in the right direction. They got him upright against the horse's side. My left shoulder, he said. I know. I felt it. Don't use that arm. She looked at him directly for the first time, and he could see her clearly now, maybe 35, dark hair coming loose from under her hat, a face that had been weathered by outdoor work into something that was not beautiful in the way he'd been accustomed to thinking about beauty, but was completely, undeniably real. Can you stand? If you hold the horse steady. I can do that. She took the bridle. She looked at him. She did not offer false encouragement or tell him he was going to be fine. She just held the horse and waited. He stood. The world went sideways for a moment and then settled. "Good," she said. Not warmly, practically. The way you'd tell a fence post it was in the right hole. But Caleb, who had been called brilliant and powerful and formidable and twice by drunk men at dinner parties charming, felt that single word land differently than any of them. Because she wasn't saying it to flatter him or to smooth over a difficult moment. She was saying it because it was true, and because it mattered, and because they needed to move. Her name he would learn in the hour that followed, as she got him onto her horse and led the horse through the storm and kept talking to him, not kindly, but steadily, in the tone of someone who is keeping another person conscious because that is what the situation requires, was Clara Bennett. She ran a ranch in the valley below. She'd been out checking her cattle lines when she'd seen his tracks, and then the place where the tracks stopped. "Most people," she said, leading the horse carefully down the invisible slope, "would have kept riding. Why didn't you?" A pause. Practical, brief. "Because I knew what I was looking at." Later, Caleb would understand that she had meant something more than just the physical facts of a man down in a storm. But that understanding would come later, after the frost came out of his hands and the shoulder was bound, and the fever that followed ran its 3-day course in a small room off her kitchen, with a child's drawing of a horse on the wall and the sound of the storm working at the windows. For now he held on, and she led him down out of the cold, and the snow covered their tracks behind them as though they had never been on that hillside at all. "I was sick for 5 days. He didn't know this at the time because time, in that bed, did not behave normally. It came in pieces, a cup of broth pressed into his right hand by someone small, which turned out to be a girl of about 8 with serious eyes named Lily, a wet cloth on his forehead replaced periodically by someone he couldn't always see clearly. The sound of a door opening and closing, wind coming in briefly before being shut out again. Clara's voice somewhere in the house, talking to the girl, then to another child, a boy slightly older, then to no one. Just working sounds, the sound of a person doing what needs to be done. He heard, through the wall or through the fog of the fever, the sound of cattle being moved. He heard the creak of what sounded like a porch being cleared of snow. He heard the particular silence of a house that doesn't have enough warmth in it. The way people move more carefully, the way sound carries differently when no one is wasting energy. On the 5th day, he woke up clear. He was in a small room that had clearly been repurposed from something, storage maybe, or a child's room before the children were moved in together. There was a window, frost thick on the glass. There was the drawing of the horse. There was a candle stub on the floor next to the bed with a tinderbox beside it, left there deliberately so he could make light if he needed it in the night. He sat up and took stock of himself. The shoulder was bad but not broken. He'd had enough years around injured livestock and injured men to know the difference between a bad sprain and something structural. His hands were intact. His feet were intact. He had come through. He found his clothes folded on a crate near the door, dried and brushed as best they could be. He dressed slowly, favoring the shoulder, and made his way out into the kitchen. Clara was at the stove. She heard him come in and turned halfway, checking, then turned back to what she was doing. "Coffee's from this morning. Still some in the pot if you want it." "Thank you." "Sit down." He sat at the kitchen table. The boy, 12 or so, solid and cautious in the way of children who have had to be, looked up at him from the other side of the table where he was working on what looked like a harness repair, small hands moving with practiced efficiency. "I'm Caleb," Caleb said. "Cal Marsh." The boy said, "I know. Mama told us." "I'm Thomas." He went back to the harness. Clara put a mug in front of Caleb and sat down across from him with her own. She looked at him for a moment, the same assessing look she'd given him on the hillside, straightforward and without apology. "You gave us a scare," she said. "The fever." "I'm sorry. I'm not telling you so you'll apologize. I'm telling you so you know how close it was." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "You remember anything from the past few days?" "Pieces. You said some things. Talked in your sleep." She paused, and he went still. "Nothing useful. Just the kind of things people say when they're sick and they think no one's listening." He didn't ask what he'd said. She didn't tell him. "Your horse found its way here on its own," she said. "Yesterday morning. He's in the barn. He's all right." Caleb closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he said, "Mrs. Bennett, I want to—" "Clara." "Clara." He stopped. He'd been about to say something polished and grateful, something shaped by years of knowing how to speak in social situations, and he caught himself doing it and stopped. I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You don't need to. A person does what the situation calls for. She said it simply, with no expectation of anything back. Can you work? With the shoulder? The question surprised him. Not at full. Not right away. A week, maybe, before the shoulder's reliable. But you can do light work? Yes. Good. She looked at her coffee. Because I have more of it than I can do alone, and if you're going to take up a bed and eat my food, you might as well be useful. It was not kindness exactly. It was not hostility. It was something more honest than either, the plain-spoken logic of a woman who was running a ranch on the edge of what was possible and had no room in her accounting for anything that didn't contribute to the balance. Caleb looked at her. He felt something shift inside him. Not dramatically, not the way things shifted in stories, more like a muscle that had been held wrong for a long time and was only now, very carefully, beginning to release. All right, he said. Thomas looked up from the harness briefly. Lily, who had appeared in the doorway without either of them noticing, watched Caleb with the unblinking gravity that 8-year-old girls reserve for things they are seriously considering. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls of the house, looking for the gaps. It found fewer of them than it was looking for. That was the thing about this place, Caleb was beginning to understand. It wasn't sturdy in the way of wealth. Not insulated, not reinforced, not built with the specific intention of outlasting anything. It was sturdy in the way of things that have been kept together through constant attention. The kind of sturdy that requires somebody to be always paying attention. The kind that fails the moment that stops. He looked at Clara, who was already looking back out the window toward the barn, calculating something, planning something, her mind already on the next problem. He thought, she has been doing this alone. He thought, she has been doing this alone for a while now. He thought, for the first time since he'd ridden away from his own house in the dark before dawn on a Tuesday, there is something useful I can do here. Not because of who he was, not because of what he owned, just because of what he knew and what he was willing to do with it, in this kitchen, in this cold, alongside these people who hadn't asked him for a single thing except to be honest about whether he could work. He picked up his coffee with his right hand and held it, and the warmth came through the mug into his palm, and he didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The storm had another 4 days in it at least. There was work to plan. There was always more work than there was time. And for the first time in longer than he could measure, Caleb Whitmore, who was nobody out here, who was just Cal Marsh with a bad shoulder and a borrowed bunk and a horse in a stranger's barn, felt the specific, unfamiliar weight of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He didn't trust the feeling. He'd learned enough by now to know that feelings like that needed to be tested before they could be believed. But he didn't dismiss it either. He finished his coffee and asked Clara where she kept her tools. The tools were kept in a lean-to off the back of the barn, organized in the way of someone who couldn't afford to lose time looking for things. Every hook had its purpose. Every handle faced the same direction. Caleb stood in the lean-to doorway on his first morning upright and looked at the arrangement and understood something about Clara Bennett that no conversation had yet told him. She was not surviving on luck or stubbornness alone. She was surviving on system, on the refusal to waste a single motion. He took what he needed and went to work. The shoulder limited him in ways that were humbling. He couldn't lift above chest height without a grinding sensation that made his vision blur at the edges. He couldn't grip with his left hand for more than a few minutes before it started to shake. So he adapted, used the right arm for the heavy pulls, the left for steadying, found angles that kept him functional, while the tissue knit itself back together. He split firewood one-handed, bracing the log with his knee. He repaired a section of the chicken coop roof working from his knees rather than standing, because that kept the motion in the range his shoulder would tolerate. Thomas watched him from a distance the first morning. Not obviously. The boy had the frontier child's gift for appearing to be doing something else entirely while tracking everything around him. By noon, he had drifted close enough that they were working within 20 feet of each other, Thomas mucking out the smaller stalls while Caleb worked on the coop. "You do that different," Thomas said finally. Not an accusation, just an observation. "Do what different?" "Split wood. Most men use both hands. Most men haven't done something stupid to their shoulder." Thomas considered this. Pa used to split wood with one hand sometimes, when he was showing off. Caleb glanced at him. The boy's face was neutral, directed at the stall floor. Your father was a one-handed show-off? Something shifted at the corner of Thomas's mouth. Not quite a smile. Sometimes. How long has he been gone? 2 winters. Thomas moved the hay without looking up. Fever. Same as almost got you. Caleb didn't say he was sorry. He'd learned early, from years of watching men navigate grief and loss in communities where sentiment was a thing you felt privately, that sorry was usually for the person saying it more than the person hearing it. Instead, he said, "He teach you that harness work I saw you doing yesterday?" Some of it. Mostly I figured out the rest. You figured it right. Those stitches were cleaner than a lot of men would manage. Thomas looked up briefly, gauging whether this was being said because it was true or because Caleb wanted something. Apparently he decided it was true. He went back to the stall. Mama taught me the stitch. She's better at it than me. She seems better at most things than most people, Caleb said. Thomas didn't argue with that. Clara came through the barn an hour later, checking cattle, moving with the particular efficiency of someone for whom each task was also a brief opportunity to assess the next 3. She slowed at the coop, looked at Caleb's repair without saying anything, looked at the angle he'd used to compensate for the shoulder, and moved on. That evening at the table, she said without preamble, "The repair on the coop roof will hold through the winter, but the joint at the north corner needs to be redone in spring when you can use both arms." "I know," Caleb said. "I'll mark it." She looked at him across the table. Something in her expression shifted very slightly. Not softening, not warmth, but a small recalibration, the way a person adjusts their estimate of something when the evidence warrants it. Lily said, "Are you staying until spring, Mr. Marsh?" "Lily," Clara said, "I'm just asking." Caleb looked at the girl. She had her mother's directness in miniature, the same unblinking quality of attention. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "That depends on a lot of things." "It depends on Mama," Lily said, with the complete accuracy of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned to talk around things. Clara gave her daughter a look that contained volumes. Lily appeared unmoved. That night, after the children were in bed, Caleb sat at the kitchen table and listened to Clara move through the house doing the last of the day's accounting. The small ledger she kept on a shelf near the stove. The figures she went over each night in the same order, methodical and quiet. He'd noticed she did this after the children were asleep. He'd noticed she never let them see the ledger. He asked, because she struck him as someone who responded better to direct questions than to careful approach, "How bad is it?" She didn't pretend not to know what he meant. She set the pencil down and looked at the figures for a moment before answering. "We'll make it through winter. The cattle are thinner than I want them, but there's enough hay if we're careful. The mortgage is current." She paused. "Barely." "Spring?" "Spring is the problem." She closed the ledger, not to hide it, but because the conversation didn't require it open. "We lost 6 head to the cold snap in October. That's 6 less to sell in spring. The price on beef is down from last year. I need to replace a section of the south fence before the cattle can use that pasture again, and I don't have what I need for the materials." "What about help? Other ranchers in the valley?" The expression that crossed her face was complicated and brief. "Some of them have offered, the kind of offers that come with terms attached." She picked up her coffee. "Gideon Cross offered to buy out the South 40 last spring. Said small operations like this one aren't sustainable, and I'd be doing myself a favor by reducing the acreage and concentrating on what's manageable." "Gideon Cross. You know him?" "I know the type," Caleb said, which was more than true and less than honest. Gideon Cross was, in fact, someone whose name Caleb had encountered in territory land conversations before he left his own life behind. A man who had built a significant operation in this valley over the past decade, largely by acquiring parcels from ranchers who'd hit their hard seasons 1 year too many. Not illegal. Not even, by the harsh accounting of the frontier, particularly unusual. Just a man who understood that difficulty was an opportunity if you were the one who didn't share in it. "He's not wrong technically," Clara said. "A ranch this size, with one adult running it, is hard. He knows that, and I know that." She looked at her coffee. "But this land was my husband's family's. His father broke it. We broke more of it together. My children grew up on it." She stopped. "I'm not selling the South 40. "No," Caleb agreed. "You're not." She looked at him, slightly surprised by the certainty of it. I mean, he started. No, I know what you mean. She almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive. You've been here 4 days and you've already decided. I've been watching you work for 4 days. That's enough to decide. The almost smile went away, replaced by something more guarded. She looked at him for a moment with that direct, measuring quality that he was beginning to understand was simply how she looked at everything. Not suspicion, exactly, but the habit of a woman who had learned not to take what people showed her at face value until she'd had time to check what was underneath. You should know, she said, that I'm not a charity project. I'm not something that needs saving. I know that. I'm also not... She stopped, chose different words. I don't know you, Cal Marsh. I know you work hard, and you seem to know what you're doing, and you were honest about your shoulder when most men would have tried to hide it. That's 3 days of information. It's not a lot. No, he agreed. It isn't. So let's leave it at that for now. You work, I'll feed you and give you the bunk. Come spring, we'll see where things stand. She stood up, put the ledger back on its shelf. That's all I'm offering. That's enough, Caleb said. She went to bed without saying goodnight because she was that kind of practical, and Caleb sat a while longer at the table, listening to the storm continue its slow work outside, and thought about what she'd said. A charity project, something that needs saving. He thought about all the times in his previous life when he had, without using those words, thought about people in exactly those terms. Offered help that was shaped more by the pleasure of being the one helping than by what the other person actually needed. Written checks to causes he'd never investigated because the act of writing the check felt like participation. He sat with that for a while. It wasn't comfortable. Outside, something in the barn shifted, probably Scratch, moving in his sleep the way old horses do. And the wind answered. Caleb blew out the lamp and went to his room. He lay in the dark with the candle stub and the tinderbox within reach, as Clara had left them, because she'd understood without being asked that a sick man alone in the night might need light. And he stared at the ceiling and thought about the South 40 and the fence materials and the 6 cattle lost in October. And his mind, which had spent 15 years running the logistics of an operation 10 times this size, started, quietly and without his permission, to work on it. He told it to stop. It didn't stop. By the time he fell asleep, he had 3 ideas, and one of them was actually good. He spent the next several days testing them against the reality of the land. Clara didn't ask what he was doing when he spent an afternoon walking the fence lines, noting where the posts had heaved in the freeze and thaw cycles, where the wire was holding and where it was one hard winter away from failing. She didn't ask when he spent an evening sketching something on a piece of paper and then folded it and put it in his coat pocket. She watched, in the way she watched everything, but she didn't ask. He understood that this was a form of trust, the kind that doesn't make itself visible until it's already decided. Thomas started following him on the fence walks by the 3rd day. Not to help, initially, just to watch, in the way the boy absorbed everything around him, comparing it against his existing understanding. By the 4th day, he was asking questions. Why are you marking those posts with the notch? Because they've heaved more than 2 inches. In spring, when the ground softens, they'll lean and the wire will go slack. Better to know where they are now than find out when a cow walks through. Thomas looked at the post. He took his own knife out and made a 2nd notch below Caleb's, matching it precisely. In case yours gets covered by snow, he said. Caleb looked at him. Good thinking. Thomas walked on ahead to the next post, checking it the way Caleb had shown him. Lily asked one morning if Caleb knew how to make a proper knot for a rope snare, because she'd seen tracks in the snow behind the chicken coop, and she wanted to know if a fox was getting into the area. Caleb showed her 3 knots, a running knot, a figure 8, and what his own father had called a patience knot, though he'd never heard anyone else call it that. Lily practiced all 3 until she had them right, with the focused intensity of a child who does not consider things done until they're done correctly. Then she went outside to set her snare and came back an hour later with snow in her hair and a look of satisfaction that required no explanation. Did you get it? Thomas asked. Not yet, but I'll get it. Clara watched this from across the room and didn't say anything, but something in her posture changed, some small-held thing releasing. Caleb noticed this the way he'd been noticing many small things. The slight way her shoulders were different when the children were settled and occupied versus when she was managing them, while also managing everything else. The way she ate faster when she was worried about something, and slower when she'd solved a problem, at least temporarily. He noticed that she was often, under the practical surface, worried. He noticed that she never showed this to the children if she could help it. He also noticed, on the 8th day of his being there, that the worry was higher than it had been. She went through the ledger twice that evening instead of once. She stood at the window for a long time after supper, looking out at the barn. "What is it?" he asked. "Two of the cattle in the north pasture look off. Not sick yet, but they're moving slow and they're not eating the way they should." "Can I see them in the morning?" "You know cattle." "Some," which was a significant understatement he delivered with a flat face. She looked at him sideways. "You're a man of many limited skills, Cal Marsh." "I know a little about a lot of things." "Where'd you ranch before?" A pause. Not long enough to be suspicious, he hoped. "Different places. Moved around some." She held his gaze for a moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing more than he was showing her, which was a feeling he wasn't accustomed to and wasn't sure what to do with. Then she looked back at the window. "We'll go out at first light." The two cattle in the north pasture were standing apart from the others in the stiff-legged, hunched way that Caleb recognized from years of watching animals in the early stages of what could become many different things. He walked around them carefully, checked their eyes, felt along their sides, watched their breathing. "They're cold," he said. "Not sick. Not yet. The shelter out here is blocking wind from 2 directions, but the third is open. They're burning too much heat standing still." Clara stood with her arms crossed, listening. "There's not enough material to extend the shelter." "You don't need to extend it. You need to redirect them." He walked the pasture, looking at the layout, the way the wind came through the gap in the ridge to the northwest and moved across the flat ground in a narrow corridor. "If you move the fence line here," he indicated a line with his arm, "and close off this section, they'll naturally cluster against that rise. The rise will do the work the shelter isn't doing." Clara looked at the rise. She looked at the existing fence. She was calculating materials, time, whether it would work. "It'll take a day," he said. "Maybe less." "With 2 of us?" "With 2 of us, yes." She nodded once. "Tomorrow. Today we get the fence materials sorted." They worked until the light went. It was the first time they'd worked directly alongside each other. Not in the same general vicinity, but on the same task. One person's motion informing the others. Clara worked with a physical efficiency that Caleb found himself studying in spite of himself. The way she positioned her body to get maximum mechanical advantage. The way she never made 2 trips where one would do. She didn't look to him for direction. She didn't look for approval. She worked as though he was a competent adult who didn't need to be checked on, and Caleb understood how rare that actually was. They were pulling wire at the far end of the section when she said, without looking up, "You're not what I thought you were." He kept his hands on the wire. "What did you think I was?" Man who'd been knocked around by bad luck and bad decisions. Too proud to admit it. She glanced up briefly. "The way you carry yourself, the way you think about problems. That's not something you get from drifting." The wire hummed in the cold. Caleb chose his words carefully. "Maybe I had a different life once. That doesn't mean it's the life I've got now." Clara watched him. "I'm not asking for your history, Cal. A man's entitled to keep his own past." She went back to the wire. "I'm just saying I notice things." "I know you do. And you're not what the clothes say you are." He didn't have an answer for that. Not an honest one. So he didn't give an answer at all, and she didn't push, and they finished the wire section in the failing light and walked back to the house with their breath-making clouds. The cattle they moved the next day. The fence adjustment took 6 hours. By late afternoon, the 2 animals that had been struggling were already moving differently. Warmer, settled, eating. Small victory in the scale of what this ranch faced. But Clara watched them from the fence rail for a long time, and the set of her shoulders was different when she climbed down. "Good call," she said. "It was a straightforward problem." Straightforward problems are the ones people miss. She looked at him. Because they're looking for something harder. Gideon Cross arrived on a Thursday, 2 weeks after Caleb had come to the ranch. He rode in mid-morning with one hand on the reins and the other on his saddle horn, with the easy posture of a man who has decided in advance that whatever reception he receives is not going to change his schedule. He was perhaps 50, wide through the chest, with a trimmed gray beard and eyes that moved over the property with the habitual involuntary calculation of a man who thought about land in terms of what it was worth rather than what it meant. Clara met him in the yard. Caleb was repairing the porch step behind her, close enough to be present without being visible from the gate. "Clara," Cross tipped his hat. "Heard you had a rough stretch last month. Cattle losses." "We managed." "Good, good." He looked past her at the barn, the pasture. "Heard you took in a stray." His eyes found Caleb with the efficiency of a man who misses nothing. "That him?" "He's working here." Cross studied Caleb from a distance with an expression that contained, without making a performance of it, a complete dismissal. Then he looked back at Clara. "I wanted to revisit our conversation from spring about the South 40. My answer's the same, Gideon. You've had 6 months of hard since then." His voice was not unkind, which was somehow worse than if it were. "I'm not trying to take advantage of your situation. I'm offering a fair price. Better than fair. The land isn't for sale. Clara." He leaned forward on the saddle horn. "I've got twice the operation I had 3 years ago because I know when an arrangement isn't working and I make changes before the problem makes them for me. I'm not saying what you've built here isn't impressive. I'm saying you're running at the edge of what one person can sustain. I have help now." Cross's gaze went back to Caleb, flat, appraising. "A drifter you've had for 2 weeks. He's not a drifter. What is he then?" Clara didn't answer immediately, and Cross took that as the opening it was. "I'm not saying this to be harsh. I'm saying it because I knew your husband and I respected him, and I've watched you work this land for 2 years since he passed, and I don't want to see it come apart when you finally hit the wall." He straightened in the saddle. "Think on it. That's all I'm asking." He rode out without waiting for her to respond, which told Caleb everything he needed to know about what Cross thought her response would eventually be. Clara stood in the yard watching him go. Her back was to Caleb. He watched the line of her spine and said nothing, because she didn't need him to say anything right now, and he knew it. After a moment, she turned. Her face was composed, which was different from calm. "You heard that." "Most of it." "He's not wrong about the math," she said. It clearly cost her something to say it. "Technically. No. But he is wrong about what it means." She looked at the south pasture, the distant tree line where the 40 in question sat, land her husband's father had cleared with his own hands 30 years ago. People like him. They see numbers that don't add up and they call it a problem. They don't see what the numbers are measuring. Caleb looked at the same tree line. "What are they measuring?" "Everything we did to get here." She said it without sentiment, just statement of fact. "Everything the children will know this land means when they're grown." Caleb said, after a moment, "Then we need to make sure the numbers add up." She looked at him. "Not by selling the 40, he said, "but by making the operation sustainable without it. Which is possible. The land has more in it than you're currently using. Cal, I know the south fence is the problem, and I think I know how to fix it without the materials you don't have." He watched her face. "Will you listen?" She studied him. That measuring look again, going deeper this time. Looking for the angle, the hidden term, the Gideon Cross version of helpfulness that came with something attached. He held it, didn't look away, didn't fill the silence. "All right," she said finally. "Talk." He talked. He laid it out, not as a speech, not as a presentation, but the way he'd have talked through a problem with a foreman whose judgment he trusted, working through it out loud, acknowledging the complications, the places where it might not work, the variables he couldn't predict. He talked about the fence and the pasture rotation and the cattle shelter and the 2 methods he'd seen work in harsh winters and the 1 method he'd seen fail that looked similar but had a fundamental flaw. He talked for perhaps 20 minutes, standing in the yard in the cold, and Clara listened the way she did everything, completely, without interrupting, with the focused attention of someone who is running every variable against their own knowledge of the land in real time. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The pasture rotation would work," she said. "The cattle shelter modification. I'd need to see you draw it out. The numbers on the south fence I'd have to run myself." "Run them. Tell me where I'm wrong." "You might not be wrong." "I might not be. But you know this land better than I do, and you should check." She looked at him again, that same measuring assessment, and this time what he saw come into her expression was not the recalibration of earlier days, but something more careful and more fragile. The beginning of something she was not yet ready to call trust, but that was shaped like trust, that occupied the same space. "Who are you?" she said, not hostile, just honest. And Caleb, who had left everything he was to find out if there was anything left, who was standing in a yard in Wyoming in borrowed work clothes with a shoulder that was finally beginning to knit back together, who had eaten salt pork and been grateful for it, and learned the names of every cattle on this ranch and mapped the fence lines in his head because it was the only useful thing he could think of to do, felt the question land in him like a stone in still water. "I'm just a man who knows some things," he said, "and who wants to help if you'll let me." It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. He could see her knowing it wasn't enough. But she nodded, and she went inside to get the ledger, and she brought it back out and sat at the porch table in the cold and said, "Show me where you start with the numbers." And he sat down across from her and showed her. The snow came again that night, steady and quiet, covering their boot prints in the yard until you couldn't have said how many people had been standing there or what had passed between them. Inside, the lamp burned late. The numbers, when Clara ran them herself, came back the way Caleb had said they would. She didn't tell him right away. She sat with the ledger for 2 evenings, checking his logic against her own knowledge of the land, looking for the place where the plan broke down. Because in her experience, plans that looked clean on paper always broke down somewhere, and the question was only where and how badly. But the fence rotation held. The pasture sequencing held. The cattle shelter modification, once she'd drawn it out herself on the back of an envelope and looked at it from 3 angles, held. She told him on the 3rd evening, setting the ledger on the table and opening it to the page she'd been working. "You were right about the south fence, and about the rotation." She ran her finger along a column of figures. "I'd modify the shelter differently than you suggested. The angle you drew puts the windbreak in the wrong place for where the worst of our storms come from. It needs to face 10 degrees further east." Caleb looked at the envelope where she'd sketched it. "You're right," he said, without hesitation or qualification. Clara looked up. Most men, in her experience, did not say those words that quickly. They examined the counter-evidence longer than was warranted, looking for a way to agree while still being the one who'd been right first. Caleb just looked at her drawing and said she was right, and moved on. "We'll need to start on the shelter before the next storm system," she said. "If Coles's leg is still predicting weather, we've got maybe 3 weeks." "Who's Coles?" "Man in Mill Haven, old road worker. His leg's more reliable than the almanac." She almost smiled. "Don't ask me to explain it." "I'm not going to ask you to explain it," Caleb said. "When do we start?" They started the next morning. The shelter modification required pulling apart the existing north wall of the cattle enclosure and rebuilding it at the corrected angle, which was the kind of work that looked simpler on paper than it was in practice. The posts had been set 2 years ago, and the ground had frozen and thawed around them multiple times since, which meant some came out cleanly and some did not. The 3rd post on the left side had bonded with the frozen earth so thoroughly that it took Caleb and Thomas together 45 minutes and a length of chain to convince it to move. Thomas did not complain about this. He worked with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything, and when the post finally gave way and both of them went backward into the snow, he got up, looked at the post lying on the ground, and said, "Good," with a satisfaction that was entirely proportional to how long they'd been fighting it. Caleb looked at the boy and felt something in his chest that he didn't have a ready category for. Not pity. Thomas didn't invite pity. Not affection exactly, though it was something in that direction, something closer to recognition. He'd been that boy once, or had wanted to be. The version of himself that worked without an audience and felt the success of a thing in the body before anywhere else. He didn't say any of this. He picked up the post and they moved to the next one. Clara worked the other side of the enclosure with Lily, keeping her company in the specific way Lily had, which was to work on her own parallel project. Today, tightening the wire on the smaller enclosure near the chicken coop, close enough to be part of things without being underfoot. Clara had, Caleb noticed, found ways to give both children work that was real and that mattered, not busy work, not tasks designed to occupy them while the adults did the actual labor. Thomas understood the cattle. Lily understood the small systems, the birds, the kitchen garden under its snow, the mending, and the wire work. The ranch ran, in part, on what those 2 children did every day, and they knew it, and it showed in them. By the 2nd day, they had the frame of the new shelter wall in place. By the 3rd, they had it weatherproofed enough to do what it needed to do. Caleb stood back and looked at it. Clara stood beside him. They were both tired. The particular tired of outdoor labor in cold weather that settles into the joints and doesn't fully leave, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "It'll work," Clara said finally. Not a question. "It'll work," he agreed. She nodded and went inside to start supper, and Caleb stayed out a few more minutes in the last light, looking at the structure, looking at the angle they'd found, the angle Clara had corrected, the way it would redirect the worst of the northwest wind up and over the enclosure rather than letting it hammer straight through. It wasn't elegant, it was functional. It was the right solution to the specific problem in front of them, built with what they had, adjusted for what they knew. He thought about the expensive, oversized shelters on his own operation, built by contractors he'd hired and rarely visited afterward, built to a standard that was more about what he could afford than what the cattle actually needed. He thought about how much of his own ranch he'd managed from a desk rather than from the ground. He went inside and washed his hands and sat down to eat. The neighbors started coming around the following week. Not Gideon Cross. Cross was not the type to come around twice until he was ready to come around with a different kind of offer. But others, the Halverson family from the next valley over, whose eldest son rode over on a Tuesday to borrow a set of chain links and stayed 2 hours. A woman named Ruth Adler who ran a small spread 3 miles east and arrived with a jar of rendered fat and a set of opinions about the coming weather that she delivered with the authority of someone who had been on this land for 30 years and intended to be there 30 more. A pair of brothers named Dupree, who appeared one afternoon claiming to be looking for a stray yearling and spent most of their time watching Caleb work with expressions that mixed curiosity with the particular wariness frontiermen extended to newcomers who seemed to know more than they should. The Halverson boy. His name was Eric, 19, with the unfinished look of a young man who still hasn't quite decided what he's going to be, asked Caleb without much subtlety where he'd learned to set a fence post that way. "Different places," Caleb said, which was the answer he always gave and which he knew satisfied no one. "You got a way of doing things that looks like somewhere specific," Eric said, "not like a drifting man's way." "What's a drifting man's way look like?" Eric considered. "Like they learned it in a hurry and haven't had time to get it right. Maybe I had more time than most." Ruth Adler, who had stayed for supper without being formally invited and fit into the kitchen with the ease of a woman who considered most houses in the valley her partial territory, watched this exchange with bright eyes and said nothing. She watched Clara watching Caleb and said nothing about that either. But when she left that evening, she patted Clara on the arm and said quietly, but not quietly enough, "He's a good worker, that one." "He's temporary," Clara said. "Most things are, honey." Ruth pulled her coat on. "Doesn't make them less useful while they're here." Clara's face did something brief and complicated that she smoothed away before turning back to the room. Caleb didn't comment on any of this. He was learning that Clara's approach to the future was to treat it as a variable to be managed rather than a thing to anticipate, and that this was, in large part, what had kept her operational for 2 years alone on a ranch that should have required 2 adults to run. She didn't let herself want things too specifically. Wanting things too specifically was how you ended up standing somewhere, in the cold, on the wrong side of the gap between what you'd planned and what was. He understood this. He'd spent 15 years doing the opposite, planning everything, controlling everything, building a life that was as predictant as he could make it, and had ended up with a dining room full of people who were there for the predictability and not for him. He didn't say this to Clara. He wasn't sure he was ready to say it to himself yet in those exact terms. What he did instead was work and plan and watch the weather. The snow barriers were Caleb's idea and Clara's implementation. He'd seen the principle used on the plains further north, not a windbreak exactly, more a deliberate redirection, a series of low walls placed not to block the wind, but to redirect it so that it moved around the vulnerable areas rather than through them. The trick was in the placement, which required understanding not just where the wind came from, but how it moved across specific terrain, where it sped up and where it pooled, where the snow was likely to drift and accumulate versus where the ground would stay clear. He'd spent 3 days walking the land around the ranch before he felt confident he understood it well enough to propose the placement. Clara walked it with him on the 4th day, and they spent most of the afternoon in an argument, the word was not too strong, about the location of the 3rd barrier, with Clara insisting on a position 20 yards further south than Caleb's plan called for, and Caleb explaining why he thought she was wrong, and Clara explaining, with the precision of someone who had watched 12 winters move across this particular ground, exactly which direction the worst storms came from and what they did when they arrived. Caleb listened. He looked at the ground again. He thought about what she'd said. "You're right," he said, for the second time in 2 weeks, and moved the marker 20 yards south. Something shifted in her expression again. That same fractional opening that he was learning to recognize. Not trust yet, but its approaching weather. They built the barriers over 5 days, using materials that cost almost nothing: compacted snow, salvaged lumber, hay bales repositioned from their summer storage. Ruth Adler came by on the 3rd day with her 2 ranch hands and worked alongside them for the afternoon without asking or being asked, which was apparently how things worked in this valley among people who understood that winter was not a private problem. Eric Halverson came the next day and brought chain links he'd borrowed and forgotten to return, and stayed to help finish the eastern barrier, working alongside Thomas with a focused efficiency that made the boy work slightly harder and slightly better without either of them acknowledging this was happening. Gideon Cross did not come. But word traveled on the frontier the way it always did, in pieces, carried by people who were each only sharing a piece. And Caleb was aware, from things Ruth said and things Eric half mentioned and things the Dupree brothers' expressions communicated without words, that Cross was watching. It was Ruth who finally said it directly, over coffee in Clara's kitchen on a Thursday morning while Clara was outside with the cattle. "Gideon thinks you're going to make her overconfident," she said to Caleb. She said it matter-of-factly, without venom, the way she said everything. "Thinks she'll put in more work than the land can return, and when the spring figures come in bad, she'll be worse off than if she'd sold the 40 and simplified." Caleb wrapped his hands around his mug. "What do you think?" Ruth looked at him the way older women sometimes looked at men they were trying to read past the surface of. "I think Gideon's been right about enough things that people forget the times he was wrong. And I think Clara Bennett knows this land better than Gideon Cross and better than you. No offense. None taken. But I also think she's been running on empty for 2 years, and the fact that she's still standing is more testament to stubbornness than to having enough." Ruth set her mug down. "You've helped. Anyone can see that. The question is what happens to this ranch if you move on in spring?" Caleb didn't answer immediately, because there was no honest answer that he was ready to give yet. What he said instead was, "We're building it so it runs without needing me here." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "Are you?" she said. Not a question, not a challenge, something more like an assessment. "That's the plan." "Whose plan? Yours or hers?" He didn't have a clean answer to that either. Ruth picked up her mug again and didn't push it further, which he suspected was a deliberate choice on her part. She struck him as a woman who knew exactly when to leave a thing in the air. Clara came back in from the cattle check with cold, reddened cheeks and the brisk efficiency of someone who had already moved past this morning to the next 3 problems on the list. She looked between Caleb and Ruth and read the room with the accuracy she brought to everything. "What were you 2 talking about?" "Spring," Ruth said pleasantly. Clara looked at Caleb. He looked back at her. "The barriers are holding," he said. "I checked the north section this morning. The drift pattern is going the right way." She held his gaze for a moment longer than the information required. Then she sat down and poured her coffee and moved the conversation to the cattle. The storm that Coles's leg had promised arrived on a Saturday in the deep middle of January. It did not announce itself the way storms sometimes did, with a gradual darkening and a wind that built over hours. It came in the night. They went to sleep in weather that was cold but manageable and woke to the sound of something different. Caleb was awake before Clara. He'd learned to sleep lightly here, in the way he'd never had to on his own ranch where there were hands to cover the night, and something in the quality of the sound against the windows brought him out of sleep completely and immediately. He dressed in the dark and went to the window and could see nothing. White out, full and complete, visibility reduced to the length of your arm. The kind of storm that kills people not because of the cold alone, but because of the disorientation. Because a man steps out of his own barn and walks 20 feet in the wrong direction and is gone. He was in the kitchen starting the stove when Clara appeared in the doorway, already dressed. She looked at the window and took in the sound, and her face went through something quickly. Not panic, not fear, but the rapid reorganization of a person who knows what this means and is already 3 steps into responding. "The cattle," she said. I know. The barriers should redirect the worst of it, but if any of the herd has gotten into the southeast corner, I know. I'll rope to the barn. I'll come with you. Clara. Don't. She was already pulling on her outer coat. I know this land in the dark better than you do. You rope to the barn. I'll take the east line to the cattle. There was no point in arguing this. She was correct on the first point and on the second, and arguing with correct was a waste of both of them. They rigged the rope from the back porch to the barn door, which Thomas had appeared to help with. The boy had woken on his own, from the same instinct, and Caleb looked at him in the lantern light and felt that thing again, the recognition, the particular kind of sorrow and respect that comes from seeing a child who has had to grow up faster than children should. Stay in the house, Caleb told him. Thomas looked like he was going to argue. You're the one who knows where everything in the barn is if we need to send you for something, Caleb said. That's not nothing. That's essential. Stay close to the house end of the rope. This was true enough that Thomas accepted it, which told Caleb the boy was smart enough to recognize when he was being given a real reason rather than a managed one. Clara had already gone. Caleb could see the line of her rope. She'd taken the second coil from the lean-to, run it from the barn's east corner, and then could not see her because the storm had her. He went to the cattle. What happened in the next 4 hours was the kind of experience that strips away everything that isn't necessary. There was no room in it for thought about his old life, no room for the ambient guilt he'd been carrying about his deception, no room for anything except the next foot of ground and the rope in his hand and the sound of cattle in distress ahead of him. The southeast corner, which he'd worried about, had 3 animals in it who had drifted there in the night before the storm hit and were now stuck against the fence, too confused by the whiteout to find their way back to the shelter. Clara was already there when he arrived. She had the first one moving. She shouted something to him that the wind took, but her arm gesture was clear. Take the fence side, push them left, toward the shelter line. Them left, toward the shelter line. They worked without talking because talking was not possible. They worked by watching each other and by knowing, in the way that people develop when they've been working together in close quarters for enough weeks, what the other person needed from them before the need was expressed. The barriers worked. That was the thing Caleb would carry with him afterward, that standing there in the middle of the worst storm in years, in a whiteout that had already, he would learn later, destroyed 3 structures in the valley and killed livestock on 2 neighboring operations. The barriers they had built with compacted snow and salvaged lumber and repositioned hay bales were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. The wind moved around the shelter areas rather than through them. The drift pattern was going the right direction. The cattle that were in the shelter were in significantly better condition than the 3 they'd had to retrieve from the southeast corner. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt relieved and tired, and the shoulder which had been mostly healed, was reminding him what it had been through. They got all the cattle into shelter by dawn. They went back to the house and Clara made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table without speaking for a while, both of them wet and cold in the residual way that takes an hour to leave. And Thomas brought them each a dry towel from the cedar chest without being asked, and Lily appeared in the doorway and looked at both of them and seemed to decide that they were all right and went back to bed. The barriers held, Clara said eventually. Yes. She wrapped her hands around her mug. She looked at the window where the storm was still running itself against the glass. The Halverson place won't have been as ready. Neither will the Duprees. No. She looked at him. We should check on them when it's safe to go out. I was thinking the same thing. She nodded and drank her coffee. Outside, the storm reached its height in the mid-morning and then, slowly, in the way of winter storms that have made their point and don't need to make it twice, began to ease. By early afternoon, it was possible to see across the yard. By late afternoon, the sky had that particular washed quality that follows a major storm, raw and bright and very still. Caleb was checking the barrier on the north side when he heard horses. He looked up and saw 2 riders coming across the snow from the direction of the road, one slightly ahead of the other, both moving with the urgency of men who have somewhere to be. He didn't know either of them. They pulled up at the fence, and the one in front, a broad man, red-faced from the cold, with a sheriff's badge on his coat that Caleb noticed after a moment, looked at Caleb and then at the barn and then at the house. This the Bennett place? It is. You work here? I do. The sheriff looked at him. Not the way Cross looked at him. Not with dismissal. with something more careful. "What's your name?" Caleb felt the ground shift under him in the way it hadn't shifted since he'd left his own ranch 4 months ago. "Cal Marsh," he said. The other rider, who had pulled up just behind the sheriff, was looking at Caleb in a way that was different from the sheriff's way. More precise, more personal. As if he was seeing past the worn coat and the working man's bearing to something underneath. This man Caleb knew. Not well. Not a friend. Not even an associate. A land broker named Ferris, who had done business with the Whitmore operation twice in the past 3 years, and whose memory for faces was, Caleb had always heard, exceptional. Ferris was looking at him. Caleb looked back. Clara appeared on the porch behind him. "Mrs. Bennett," the sheriff said, turning to her. "I'm Sheriff Dale Hooper, out of the county seat. I've been looking for a man, so there's a family concern." He paused. "A missing person situation, you might say." The ground that had shifted under Caleb kept shifting. Ferris hadn't said anything yet. He was still looking at Caleb with that careful, particular attention. "We've had a drifter working here," Clara said, coming down the porch steps. "Cal Marsh. He was injured in the early storm, and we took him in." "Ma'am," the sheriff said, "the man I'm looking for isn't a drifter." He looked at Caleb. "Ferris. Is that him?" The silence lasted 2 seconds. It felt longer. Ferris said, "That's Caleb Whitmore." Clara went very still. Caleb did not look at her. He looked at Ferris. He looked at the sheriff. He felt the whole architecture of the past 4 months. The bunk room, the fence lines, the cattle shelter, the ledger sessions at the kitchen table, the two of them in the yard in the dark after Cross had ridden out. He felt all of it held at a particular angle, balanced on the second before he confirmed what Ferris had said. Then he said, "Yes, that's right." He heard Clara draw in a breath. He still didn't look at her. Not yet. Because he knew what he would see there, and he needed one more moment before he had to face it. "Caleb Whitmore," the sheriff repeated, in the tone of a man recalibrating. "The Whitmore operation out of the northern county." "Yes." "Your foreman's been looking for you since October. Filed a concern with my office in November. Said you left without—" The sheriff stopped, reorganizing what he'd thought he was dealing with against what was in front of him. "Sir, you've been working as a ranch hand." "I have." The sheriff looked at Clara, then back at Caleb, then at the well-built snow barriers behind them, and the sound of healthy cattle in the shelter that should, by every account of last night's storm, have been a disaster. He took off his hat. "All right," he said, to no one in particular. "All right, then." Clara's voice, when it came, was very quiet and very even. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. He turned. Her face was composed in the way it had been after Cross's visit, the surface smooth, everything underneath moving. Her eyes were direct on him with an expression he had not seen there before, something that was past anger and below hurt, and was simply, at its core, the look of a person who has just found the floor where they thought there was solid ground. "We should get the sheriff and his associate inside out of the cold," she said. Clara, "Inside," she said, "please." She went up the porch steps and held the door. Caleb looked at her for a moment, at the set of her shoulders and the hand on the door, and the way she was holding herself together with the same fundamental stubbornness that had held this ranch together for 2 years. And then he followed her inside. The door closed behind them, and the last of the storm's light faded from the yard, and the snow lay clean and unmarked over everything they had built. The sheriff and Ferris stayed for coffee because Clara offered it, and because the storm had made the road back uncertain, and because, Caleb suspected, Dale Hooper was a man who understood when a situation needed a few more minutes before anyone had to decide what it meant. Ferris wrapped his hands around his mug and had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. I was not a bad man. Caleb had never thought him a bad man, just one whose particular skill was observation, and whose instinct when he observed something was to name it. He had named it. He sat with the consequences of that in Clara's kitchen and drank his coffee and didn't say much. The sheriff asked Caleb, in the careful way of a man constructing a picture he didn't yet fully have, whether there was anything that needed official attention, whether he'd left under duress or legal complication, whether the foreman's concern needed a formal response. "I'll write to Burl myself," Caleb said. "Today. He can stand down." He was pretty worried. "I know, that's my fault." Hooper looked at him for a moment. He was, Caleb thought, probably 55, with the particular settled quality of a man who had seen enough situations that he no longer needed to perform authority in order to have it. "You want to tell me what you were doing working a hired hand position on a widow's ranch in the middle of January?" Clara, at the stove, did not turn around, but the set of her back changed slightly. "Trying to figure something out," Caleb said. "Figure what out?" "Whether I was worth anything without the things I owned." The sheriff looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the coffee in his mug. "And?" "Still working on that." Hooper set his mug down, picked up his hat from the table, and stood. "Well," he said, "you've got good cattle shelter, and your snow barriers held better than anyone else's in this valley last night, so you're worth something to somebody." He looked at Clara's back. "Ma'am, thank you for the coffee. I'm sorry for the disruption." "Safe ride back, Sheriff," Clara said, without turning. Ferris said goodbye to Caleb with an expression that was equal parts apology and relief. Apology for what he'd done, relief that it hadn't been worse. And they went out and mounted and rode back down the road that the storm had left rutted and difficult. The door closed. The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas and Lily were in the front room. Caleb had heard them go there when the horses arrived, not running away, just making themselves elsewhere, the way children do when they understand that adults are about to have a conversation that isn't for them. Thomas had taken Lily with him without being told to, which was the kind of thing Thomas did. Clara stayed at the stove for a moment after the sound of the horses faded. Then she turned around and leaned back against it and looked at Caleb across the kitchen. Her face had moved past, composed into something harder and quieter. Not rage, Clara, he had come to understand, didn't have the kind of anger that expressed itself loudly. She had the kind that went inward and became very still and very precise. "How much?" she said. He knew what she was asking. "The Whitmore operation runs about 4,000 acres. The herd was, when I left, around 300 head. There's a second parcel up north, timber mostly." She absorbed this without expression. "The house you left. It's large. Staff?" "A foreman, 2 permanent hands, seasonal workers." She looked at him for a moment. "And you walked away from that? Dressed yourself in poor clothes and came out here looking for work?" "Yes." "To see if people would treat you differently?" "Not exactly. To see if there was anything left of me if you took all that away." He paused. "Those aren't the same thing, but they're close." "They're close," she agreed. Her voice was even, too even, the kind of evenness that takes work to maintain. "And you ended up here, in my house, eating my food, working my land." She stopped. "Letting my children trust you." That landed where she meant it to land. "Yes," he said. "Did it occur to you, at any point, to tell me the truth?" "Yes." "And?" He thought about how to answer this honestly. "At first I told myself it wasn't the right moment. Then I told myself it didn't matter, that the work was real regardless of who I was, that the plan for the ranch was sound regardless of who had proposed it. Then I told myself you'd see it that way too." He stopped. "I knew, by about the 3rd week, that I was wrong about the last part." "But you didn't tell me." "No." She pushed off the stove and moved to the table and sat down, not in her usual chair but in the one closest to the window, like she needed the distance from where she normally sat. "I want to make sure I understand what happened here," she said. "A wealthy man, a very wealthy man, decided he wanted to see how regular people lived. He disguised himself as a poor drifter. He fell off his horse in a storm. I found him. I brought him into my house. I fed him with food I couldn't easily spare. My children attached themselves to him. He helped us, yes, genuinely helped us. I'm not disputing that. But the entire time he was doing it, he knew something about the situation that I didn't know, something that would have changed everything." "Yes," Caleb said. "That's what happened." "Would you have told me if Ferris hadn't come?" The question sat in the room. He'd asked himself this already, in the months since he'd understood he should tell her. Had asked it in the dark of his bunk room, had asked it working the fence line, had asked it and not answered it honestly enough. "I don't know," he said. "I'd like to think yes, but I don't know." She looked at the table. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me since you got here." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow-bright afternoon light came through the window and lit the side of her face, and Caleb sat across from her and looked at this woman who had pulled him out of a frozen hillside and fed him and given him a bunk and worked beside him and trusted him. Not easily, not all at once, but genuinely, the way trust is genuine when it's given by someone who doesn't give it often. And he felt the weight of what he'd taken from her by not being honest. Not just the information, the choice. The ability to decide, with full knowledge, whether she wanted him there. "I'm not angry that you're rich," Clara said finally. Her voice had changed slightly. Not softer, but more direct. Like she'd found the actual thing she needed to say and was saying it now. "I don't care about that. I don't care that you have 4,000 acres and a large house. That's yours. You built it. It has nothing to do with me." "Clara, let me finish." She looked at him. "I'm angry because you took away my right to choose. I trusted a man I thought I understood. A struggling worker who had nothing. Someone in the same position I'm in, roughly, making do, figuring it out, no cushion under him if things went wrong." She paused. "That man I understood. That man I could trust completely because there was nothing behind him that I didn't know about. Nothing he could hide behind." She stopped again. "You could have left any time. Did you understand that? Any time things got difficult or uncomfortable or not what you wanted, you could have just gone back. You had something to go back to. I didn't know that. I thought we were both in the same—" She stopped. "The same position," Caleb said quietly. "Yes." He said nothing for a moment, then, "You're right. I know I am." "The experiment analogy, that you were a test. I don't think that's what you thought you were doing," she said. "I think you were genuinely trying to find something. I believe that. But what you were doing had consequences for people who weren't part of your decision." She looked at him levelly. "Thomas and Lily don't know what an experiment is. They just know they trusted someone." Caleb thought about Thomas in the snow with the fence post, making his second notch below Caleb's so it wouldn't get buried. He thought about Lily and the 3 knots and the unblinking seriousness with which she'd practiced them. He thought about the way Thomas had appeared in the dark at 4 in the morning, already dressed, when the storm hit, because he'd woken up with the same instinct. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands for a moment. Not dramatically, just the gesture of a man who is sitting with something heavy. "I know," he said. Clara watched him. She wasn't softening. This wasn't a conversation that was going to end in softening. But something in her posture changed very slightly, some of the rigid composure releasing into something more tired than angry. "What are you going to do now?" she said. He lifted his face from his hands. "Go back to my ranch. Deal with what I left." He paused. "Burl's been managing it. He's a good foreman, but it's been 4 months and there are things I need to handle myself." She nodded. This was the right answer and she knew it, and so did he. "And the spring work here," he said. "The south fence, the pasture rotation. I know the plan," she said. "You drew it out well enough. I can follow it." "I know you can. I just—" He stopped. "I want you to know that everything I did here was real. The work was real. The plan is sound. I wasn't performing anything." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know that," she said. "That's the part that makes this complicated." She stood up, which was her way of ending a conversation that had said what it needed to say. She went to the stove and began making something for supper. The ordinary, necessary motion of a person who has things to do, regardless of what has just happened. Caleb sat at the table a moment longer. Then he got up and went to the front room where Thomas was at his harness work and Lily was drawing something at the small desk near the window. They both looked up when he came in. He sat down on the bench near the door, which was not his usual chair, and looked at them. "I need to tell you both something," he said. Thomas set down the harness. Lily turned from her drawing. They waited with the particular quality of attention children have when they know they're about to hear something that matters. He told them plainly, not softened, not complicated, not framed to make himself look better. His name, what his ranch was, why he'd left, how he'd ended up here, what he'd said to their mother, or as much of it as they needed to know. When he finished, Thomas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the harness in his lap. "Did you actually not know how to do things when you first came?" "Some things, yes. Some things I'd just never done myself. I'd watched men do them, or managed men who did them. There's a difference." Thomas thought about this. "But you weren't pretending. The work? No, never. Thomas nodded. He picked the harness back up. He seemed, in that particular way he had, to be processing something that he would continue processing quietly over the next several days. All right, he said, which was not forgiveness exactly, but was something in that direction. The 11-year-old's version of "I hear you, and I'll think about what it means." Lily had been watching Caleb throughout this with the unblinking gravity she brought to things she was deciding about. When he finished, she said, "Are you going to come back?" "I don't know yet, Lily." "Does Mama know?" "She knows I don't know yet." Lily considered this. "She'll be fine," she said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has watched her mother be fine through things that would have flattened someone else. "She always is." "I know she will," Caleb said. "But you could still come back," Lily said. "That's not the same as being needed back." He looked at her. 8 years old, with her mother's directness and her own particular precision. "No," he said, "it's not." He left the next morning. He'd spent the evening doing the chores he would normally have done, because leaving them undone was not who he was trying to be. He checked the cattle. He brought in the extra firewood. He looked at the snow barriers in the last light and confirmed they were still sound, that the storm hadn't compromised them in the places that mattered. Clara was in the kitchen when he came back in. She had bread going. The smell of it was in the whole house. She didn't turn around. "The north barrier has a section that loosened on the west end," he said. "I repacked it. It should hold, but check it in 2 days if there's new snow. All right?" The cattle in the southeast corner, the 2 heaviest ones, are pulling more than their share from the hay supply. If you move them to the center section, the distribution will even out. "I noticed that yesterday." "I know, I'm saying it anyway." She turned from the stove then. She was holding a wooden spoon, and she looked at him across the kitchen with that level, direct gaze that had never been entirely comfortable and had never been dishonest. "Be careful going north," she said. "There'll be drifts on the road past the Halverson cutoff. Go around the long way." "All right." She turned back to the bread. Caleb stood at the kitchen door for a moment. He wanted to say something that would be adequate to what this place had been for him, and to what he had failed to be for the people in it, and he could not find words that were adequate. So he said, "I'm sorry, Clara." She didn't turn around. "I know you are." "That's not enough." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He went to his room and got his bedroll and his bag and his coat, the old worn coat, not because he didn't have better, but because it was still his, the coat he'd ridden out in. And he went to the barn and saddled Scratch. The horse was rested and well fed, in better shape than he'd been when they arrived. He moved with slightly more ease than he had in months, the way horses sometimes do when they've had consistent care and consistent feed and haven't been pushed past their capability. Caleb ran his hand down the gelding's shoulder where the old scar was and felt the familiar texture of it, unchanged. Thomas appeared at the barn door while he was adjusting the cinch. "You forgot your knife," the boy said. He was holding the skinny knife Caleb had left on the workbench. "You keep it," Caleb said. Thomas looked at the knife. He looked at Caleb. "That's a good knife." "It is. You'll use it better than I will." Thomas turned the knife over in his hands, studying it with the thoroughness he brought to things he was deciding whether to accept. Then he put it in his belt. "The second notch on the fence posts," he said. "In spring, when things shift, the ones that have heaved more than 3 inches, you'd pull those and reset them? Before the ground softens completely, while there's still some frost in it to hold the new set." "How far down?" "Deeper than you think you need to go. Add 6 inches to what looks right." Thomas nodded. He looked at Scratch. "He's a good horse." "The best I've had." "Even with the scar?" "Especially with the scar." Caleb checked the cinch one more time. "Take care of your mother, Thomas. Not because she needs it. She doesn't, because it's worth doing." The boy looked at him. 11 years old, with his father 2 winters gone, and his mother's stubbornness built into him, and a knife in his belt that was too big for him, and a knowledge of fence posts and cattle that most men twice his age didn't have. "I already do," he said. "I know," Caleb said. "I'm saying it anyway." He led Scratch out of the barn and mounted and rode toward the gate. He didn't look back at the house. Then he stopped, because there was something he needed to understand about himself regarding that habit. He looked back. The house was where it had always been. Smoke from the kitchen chimney. The snow barriers he and Clara and the Halverson boy and Ruth Adler's ranch hands had built together, standing in the morning light. The chicken coop with its patched roof. The cattle shelter at the corrected angle. Clara was standing on the porch. She wasn't waving. She was just standing there, hands at her sides, watching him go, in the straight-backed, direct way she did everything. He raised one hand. She raised one hand. He rode north. The road was bad past the Halverson cutoff, as she'd said it would be, and he went around the long way, which added an hour to his ride but kept him out of the worst of the drifts. He rode through a landscape that was white in every direction, interrupted occasionally by the dark line of a fence or the smear of a tree line, and he thought about what Clara had said. Not the parts that had hurt. He'd been carrying those since before she said them, had been earning them for 4 months. He thought about the part that was most true and most difficult. That real trust cannot be tested like an experiment. That it had to be earned through honesty and not through the evidence you gathered while pretending to be something you weren't. He'd spent his whole life before this being tested, being assessed and valued and treated as a prize or a threat or a resource depending on who was doing the assessment. He'd left to escape that. He'd thought the escape was about identity, about stripping away the wealth and the name. But what Clara had shown him, without meaning to teach him anything, was that the problem wasn't the wealth. The problem was the withholding. The keeping of himself at a strategic remove so that he could observe without being observed, could evaluate without being evaluated. He'd done it his entire life. He'd done it at his own dining table with Margaret Hollis and with every land broker and county commissioner and fair-weather friend who had sat in his house. He'd taken his natural wariness, which was not unreasonable, which had been built by real experience, and turned it into a system of distance. And then he'd left, looking for connection, and found it on a frozen hillside, and maintained the distance anyway because the distance was so habitual, by then he almost couldn't feel it. Clara had felt it. Not as distance. She'd taken him at face value because she had no reason not to. But she'd felt the place where something should have been and wasn't. She'd said it herself. You're not what the clothes say you are. She'd known, in the way of someone with good instincts and enough hard experience to trust them, that the surface and the substance didn't match. She hadn't pushed because she'd respected his right to his own past. He'd mistaken that respect for permission. He rode through the afternoon and into the early evening and made camp at a spot he'd used before, in the shelter of a low ridge with enough dead wood nearby for a fire. He ate cold jerky because the fire was for warmth, not cooking, and he lay in his bedroll looking up at a sky that had cleared to the dense, close-packed stars of a winter night at altitude, and he thought about what came next. Not in the grand sense, in the practical, Clara-style sense of what are the actual steps, in order, starting tomorrow. Write to Burl. Get back to his own operation and spend a week understanding what 4 months of absence had done to it, what Burl had managed well and what had slipped, what needed immediate attention and what could wait for spring. Deal with the accounts he'd left unresolved. Make the decisions he'd been avoiding before he left. Not because they were hard, he understood now, but because they were lonely, and making them alone in a large house while people who didn't know him ate at his table had become unbearable. The decisions would still be lonely. He didn't have a solution for that, but he had, at minimum, a clear understanding of what had made them lonely before, and he had, slowly, incrementally, in the way of things that happened through action rather than insight, a different version of himself than the one who had ridden out of his own yard in the dark before dawn on a Tuesday. Not better, necessarily. Not fixed, but different, cracked open in some places that had needed it. He thought about the snow barriers. He thought about Clara's correction, 10 degrees further east, and the way it had changed the whole function of the structure. A small adjustment to the angle. Everything redirected. He fell asleep thinking about that. He was back on his own land in 4 days. Burl was standing in the yard when he rode in, which meant someone on the road had ridden ahead with word. The foreman was a compact, weathered man of 50 who had worked this land for 11 years and who had never, in 11 years, called Caleb anything but sir. He looked at Caleb now, at the worn coat and the 4 months of work and weather in his face, and the old horse who was tired but sound, and he didn't say sir. He said, "You look like hell." Caleb got down from scratch and handed the reins to the stable hand who had appeared. "I know. You couldn't send a letter?" "I sent one from the road." "You sent one 4 days ago. I've been sending letters to sheriff's offices since November. I know, Burl. I'm sorry. Burl looked at him for a long moment. He had the particular expression of a man who has been genuinely worried and is now converting that worry into something more manageable. You hurt? Shoulder. It's mostly healed. What happened to the shoulder? Came off my horse in a storm. Burl looked at Scratch. That horse come off with you? He went down in a ditch. He came through all right.
Burl looked back at Caleb. You want to tell me what you were doing out there? I will. Over supper. There's a lot to catch up on. Yes, there is, Burl said with the quiet, controlled emphasis of a man who has been running someone else's 4,000-acre operation for 4 months without instructions and has things to say about that. They went inside. The house was exactly as Caleb had left it, because Burl was the kind of man who maintained things precisely as they were supposed to be maintained, and for a moment Caleb stood in the front hallway and felt the specific weight of the place. Its size, its insulation, its reliable warmth, the painting on the wall above the fireplace with its $4 sunset that someone had told him he should know the value of. He looked at the painting. He thought about the chicken coop with its patched roof. He thought about the drawing of a horse on the wall of a small room, done in pencil by a child, tacked up with 2 nails. He thought about a candle stub left on the floor next to a bed so a sick man wouldn't wake in the dark without light. He took off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door. Burl, he said, going toward the kitchen where supper smells were already coming. I want to talk about the winter shelter program. For the smaller operations in the Southern Valley. Burl behind him paused. The smaller operations. There are ranches out there running on nothing. Good land, solid operators, not enough margin. One bad season and Cross or someone like him picks them up for less than they're worth. What kind of program? Caleb pushed through the kitchen door. The kind that doesn't require them to sell anything to get through the winter. Shared resources, emergency supplies, technical support. He sat down at the kitchen table. A different table than Clara's, larger, steadier, with none of the intimacy of a room where 4 people have learned to read each other across the salt and the coffee pot. The kind I should have been running 5 years ago, instead of building the 4th pasture that doesn't produce what the first 3 already cover. Burl sat down across from him. He looked at Caleb for a long time with the expression of a man who has worked for someone 11 years and thought he knew them and is now revising that in a direction that isn't entirely negative. All right, he said, I'm going to need your help figuring out what's practical. I figured you might. Burl poured the coffee. He set the pot down. He looked at his own mug. You want to tell me who it was that gave you this idea? Because it doesn't sound like something you came up with sitting on 4,000 acres by yourself. Caleb looked at his coffee. Someone I met, he said. Someone who knew how to do more with less than anyone I've ever seen. He paused. Someone I owe a significant debt to. Not the kind you can pay back with money. Burl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the carefully neutral tone of a man who has decided to ask the thing directly, rather than circle it. Is she all right, the operation? Caleb looked at him. She'll make it through the winter. Spring's the question. And is that going to become your question? He looked at his coffee again. He thought about what he'd said to the sheriff, still working on that. He thought about Clara on the porch with her hand raised and her straight back and her complete, infuriating, admirable unwillingness to need anything from anyone that she hadn't verified was real. I don't know yet, he said. He picked up his mug. He drank. Outside, on his own land, his own cattle moved in his own shelters that were oversized and overbuilt and perfectly adequate. The night came down cold and clear. There was a letter to write, and accounts to review, and a foreman to debrief, and a ranch program to design from scratch, and none of it was going to wait for him to be ready. He asked Burl for paper and started on the letter to Clara first. He wrote 3 drafts and threw the first 2 away. The third was short. He told her the south fence plan would work, and that he'd calculated the spring materials list and was sending the cost of it to the Millhaven dry goods account in her name, not as a gift and not as a loan, but as payment for the work she'd let him do on her land, which had been worth considerably more to him than the materials were worth to him financially. He told her the plan was hers. She'd improved it at every stage and it would work because of her corrections more than his original thinking. He told her he was starting something in the Southern Valley that he'd like to talk to her about when there was a time for it. He told her he was sorry. Not again, not additionally, just once, plainly,
without asking for anything back. He sealed it and set it aside and started on the letter to Burl's contact at the county land office about emergency shelter resources for small operations. He worked until midnight. The lamp in his large, well-heated, adequately furnished house burned steadily, and outside the snow lay clean over his 4,000 acres. And somewhere 200 miles south, a woman was checking on snow barriers in the dark, because that was what the evening required, and her children were asleep in a house that was cold in the way of houses that are heated by attention rather than abundance. He did not let himself imagine what she was thinking. He was done, for now, with imagining things from a safe distance. He picked up his pen and went back to work. Clara's reply to his letter came 3 weeks after he sent it, which was about as fast as the mail moved in winter between the Southern Valley and the Northern County, and which meant she had not taken long to decide whether to reply at all. The letter was short. 4 sentences. The materials account was received. She had not used it yet and was deciding whether she would. The spring fence work was underway on the schedule he'd laid out. Thomas had reset 2 posts in the southeast corner already, deeper than they looked like they needed to go. That was all. No signature beyond her initial, no acknowledgement of the apology, no door opened or closed. Caleb read it twice, folded it, and put it in the desk drawer where he was keeping things that required him to be patient. Then he went back to work on the Valley program, which was consuming most of his waking hours and a fair portion of the ones that were supposed to be for sleeping. The program had no official name yet. Burl called it the Shelter Project. Caleb just called it the work. It had begun with a letter to the county land office and had grown, in the way of things that address a real need in a place where people have been quietly desperate for something to address it, faster than he'd planned. By February, he'd had responses from 11 small operations in the Southern Valley. By March, 3 of them had ridden up to meet with him in person, coming 200 miles in variable winter weather because they wanted to look at the man behind the offer before they decided whether to trust it. He respected this. He sat with them at his kitchen table and answered their questions plainly, including the ones that were really asking, "What do you want from us in return?" "Nothing you don't want to give," he told a woman named Ortega, who ran a sheep operation east of Mill Haven and who had the same quality of clear-eyed, unhurried assessment that Clara had, the quality of someone who had learned that caution was not the same as unfriendliness. If the emergency shelter program helps you through a bad winter and you want to contribute to it for the next family in your position, you do. If you don't, you don't. "That's not how things usually work," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm trying to change how things usually work." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I heard about the Bennett operation, the snow barriers, the woman and the drifter." "You heard about that. Word travels." Her expression was neutral but not unfriendly. "Was that part of this, the program?" "No," he said. "That was personal." She seemed to find this answer more satisfying than a complicated one would have been. She signed the participation letter before she left. Burl watched all of this with the expression of a man who has worked for someone for 11 years and is seeing them, possibly for the first time, doing the thing they were actually built to do. He didn't say this. Burl was not a man who said things like that, but Caleb caught the expression once or twice and understood it. "You could have done this years ago," Burl said once, in early March, looking over the expanded list of participating operations. "I know. What stopped you?" Caleb looked at the list. "I was busy building the 4th pasture." Burl looked at him. "That's not entirely a joke," Caleb said. "I know it isn't," Burl said, and went back to his work. Spring came the way it always came to Wyoming. Not gently, not as a clean transition, but as an argument between seasons that the cold occasionally won for days at a time before finally losing. The snow retreated in stages, leaving the ground soft and unreliable underfoot, and the cattle came out of winter thinner than anyone wanted but sound, and the work shifted from preservation to preparation. Caleb rode south in the 2nd week of April. He didn't write ahead to say he was coming. He'd thought about it and decided that announcing himself was a way of asking permission for something he wasn't sure he had the right to ask for yet. Better to come and see what the land looked like and whether the spring work had gone the way the plan called for, and whether there was anything useful he could do while he was there. That was a reason to come that didn't require her to answer a question she hadn't been asked. The road south was passable, but only just. He made it in 2.5 days, camping rough both nights, and came into the valley on a Thursday morning when the sky was the particular clear, washed blue of early spring, and the mud was deep in the low spots and the grass was beginning to push through the dead winter cover in the south-facing areas. He found the south fence first. He hadn't gone looking for it deliberately. The road ran past the south pasture before it reached the house. But he slowed Scratch at the fence line and looked at it and felt something in his chest that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. The fence was done. Not just repaired, rebuilt, properly, with the post depths he'd specified and the wire tension that the rotation plan required. He could see from the road 2 of the marker notches Thomas had added alongside his own original marks from months ago. The boy had continued the system through the winter and into spring, tracking which posts needed attention, working the line systematically. He sat on Scratch for a moment, looking at the fence. He thought about what it had taken to build it. Not in materials, in the accumulated daily decisions of a woman who had reason to give up and hadn't, in the work of a 12-year-old who had taken a knife in his belt and a set of instructions about post depths and made them his own, in the stubbornness of keeping a plan going when the person who'd made the plan was gone and it would have been easier to let it slide. He rode on to the house. Clara was in the south pasture when he arrived, which meant she heard Scratch on the road before she saw who it was. She was checking cattle, moving through the herd with that efficient reading gaze she brought to the animals, checking each one briefly and moving on. She looked up when he reached the pasture fence. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to the cattle. He got down from Scratch and tied him to the fence post and climbed over. He didn't ask if he could come in. He walked toward her and fell in beside her as she moved through the herd, and they checked cattle together in silence for a while, because that was something they knew how to do together, and it was as good a place to start as any. After a few minutes, she said, without stopping, "The third cow from the left is favoring her front right leg. Started 2 days ago. I've been watching it." He looked at the animal. Stone bruise, probably. Ground still rough in the low spots. "That's what I thought." They moved on through the herd. A minute passed. "The fence looks right," he said. Thomas finished it in March. He had Eric Halverson help with the corner posts. Good thinking on the corner posts. It was Thomas's thinking. "I know." Another minute. They completed the circuit of the herd and came back to where Scratch was tied. Clara stopped and looked at him. She had her arms crossed, not in a defensive way, in the way of someone standing still in a wind. Her face had some of the same winter weather in it that his did. The spring was new enough that the cold hadn't fully left anyone's complexion. She looked tired in the specific way of people who have come through something hard and are only now allowing themselves to acknowledge it. "Why are you here, Cal?" she said. And then, immediately, with the slight correction of someone who is going to be precise about things now, "Caleb." He'd known she would ask this directly, and he'd spent 2.5 days on the road thinking about how to answer it directly. "I'm here because I wanted to see whether the fence worked and whether the cattle came through and whether Thomas reset those posts right," he said. "Those are real reasons, and they're true. And also because I wanted to see you, and that's true too, and I'm not going to dress it up as something else." She looked at him. She didn't look away, didn't smooth over the moment. "The letter," she said. "The materials account." "Yes. I used it." "I know. Burl keeps the accounts." "I wasn't sure I was going to," she said. "I sat with it for a long time. Felt like accepting something I hadn't decided to accept yet." "Why did you?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because the fence needed doing, and my pride wasn't going to drive posts." She looked at the south pasture. "And because I knew you'd calculated it right, that it was what the work was worth and not a gesture." "It was what the work was worth," he said. "You improved that plan at every stage, the angle on the shelter, the post depth, the barrier placement. Everything that actually worked came from your corrections to what I'd proposed." She looked at him sidelong. "You're overstating it." "I'm not." "You're doing the thing where you give someone credit to make them more comfortable." "I'm not," he said again. "I spent 4 months figuring out the difference between saying things because they're useful and saying them because they're true. I'm saying this because it's true." She held his gaze for a moment, looking for the thing she used to look for, the hidden term, the angle underneath the generosity. He let her look. He had nothing to hide now, and the feeling was so unfamiliar, it was still slightly uncomfortable, which he thought was probably appropriate. "Lily's been asking when you were coming back," Clara said. "What did you tell her?" "That I didn't know if you were." What did she say? Something moved briefly in Clara's expression. She said you would. She said she could tell. She looked at the cattle. She's 8. She can't actually tell. Maybe she could, Caleb said. Clara didn't answer that. She started walking back toward the house, which was her way of continuing a conversation by moving it somewhere else. He fell in beside her. They were halfway across the yard when she said, "There's something I want to show you." She took him around the side of the house to the kitchen garden, which was just beginning to show the first green edges of things coming back. But that wasn't what she was showing him. At the far end of the garden, against the fence, there was a small structure he hadn't seen before. A low frame, maybe 6 feet square, with a roof of oilcloth weighted at the corners. He looked at it. Cold frame. I extended the garden. We can start seeds 6 weeks earlier now. She looked at the structure with the expression she used for things that had worked. It was Lily's idea. She read about it in a pamphlet Ruth Adler brought from Cheyenne. She built half of it herself. Lily built it. With Thomas doing the corner joints, she drew the plan. Caleb looked at the cold frame. He thought about the 8-year-old with 3 knots and a fox snare and an unblinking certainty about how things were going to turn out. I thought about the way she'd watched him across the room from the doorway in those first days, deciding about him with a seriousness that most adults didn't bring to the people they were deciding about. She's going to be something, he said. She already is something, Clara said. She just doesn't know the word for it yet. They stood at the cold frame for a moment, and the spring light came across the kitchen garden, and Caleb felt the particular quality of the place again, the specific weight of it, the way it was held together by attention rather than abundance. He'd felt it in January, and he felt it now, and the difference was that now he understood what he was feeling. He wasn't looking at a struggling operation. I was looking at something that worked because the people running it understood the difference between what they needed and what they'd been told they should want. He'd spent most of his adult life not knowing that difference. I've been running a program, he said, in the Southern Valley. Emergency resources for small operations, shared supply, technical support, pre-winter preparation. He paused. It's been going since February. 11 operations participating so far. Clara turned to look at him. I want to talk to you about it, he said. Not to ask you to join it. You've been doing it on your own already. More because... He stopped, reorganized. Because you know these operations. You know which ones are running honest and which are running on pride instead of land sense. You know who needs what. I don't. You're asking for my help. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her thinking it through, not the program itself, which she was already understanding as clearly as she understood a fence line, but what his asking meant. What it would make her in relation to him if she said yes. This isn't a way of being here, she said carefully. The program. It's not, you're not building a reason to come around. The program exists regardless of whether I come around, he said. It'll run whether you're part of it or not. I'm asking because it would be better with your knowledge in it. That's the only reason. And you coming around, she said. What's the reason for that? He looked at her. He'd gotten better in the past several months at not managing what he said, at not pre-shaping his words for the impression they would make rather than the truth they needed to carry. It was harder than most skills he'd had to learn. He was not good at it yet, but he was getting better. Because I want to, he said. Because I think about this place. Because I think about you and your children and whether the cattle came through and whether Thomas got those posts right. Because I left here in January carrying something I hadn't put down yet, and I need to know if there's a way to put it down honestly. He paused. And because the only things I've done in the past year that felt real were the things I did here. I'm not asking you to do anything about that. I'm telling you because you asked and because you deserve an honest answer. Clara looked at him for what felt like a long time. The spring light moved. Somewhere in the chicken coop, something expressed an opinion. You're different, she said finally. From when I came in January? From anyone I've met out here. She said it not as a compliment, but as a plain statement of a fact she'd arrived at despite herself. Most men who have what you have, they either hide it to seem like less, or they put it out front so you know what they are immediately. You hid it for the wrong reason at first. Now you're not hiding it. That's... She stopped. That's different. I'm still figuring out who I am without the things I own, he said. I haven't finished that. I know.
She looked at the cold frame again. But you know you haven't finished it. That's further along than most people get. They went inside and Clara made coffee, and Caleb sat at the kitchen table that he knew better than most tables he'd owned. And Thomas came in from the morning chores with mud on his boots and stopped when he saw Caleb. And something in the boy's face did a thing that it tried not to do, and then did anyway. A brief, unguarded acknowledgement, quickly covered over with the 11-year-old's attempt at composure. Your posts in the southeast corner were set right, Caleb said. Deeper than they needed to look. I saw them from the road. The third one gave me trouble, Thomas said, pulling off his boots. Ground was still frozen 3 inches down. I had to use the bar. That's the right tool. I know. Thomas set his boots by the door and came to the table. He looked at Caleb with the measuring quality he'd always had. You staying? For a while.
Thomas nodded. He sat down across from Caleb and picked up the harness piece he'd been working on yesterday, or so it appeared, as though the work had simply paused and was resuming, and went back to it. The acceptance in this was so complete and so unremarked upon that it was the most generous thing anyone had done for Caleb in a long time. Lily appeared at noon, coming in from the garden with dirt on her hands and the cold frame pamphlet tucked under her arm. She saw Caleb at the table and stopped and looked at him with the same unblinking assessment he remembered, and then said, I told Mama you were coming. I heard, Caleb said. She didn't believe me. I did consider it, Clara said from the stove. You said you didn't know. Considering something and knowing it are different, Lily. Lily appeared to file this distinction for future use. She came to the table and sat down and put the pamphlet in front of Caleb. Do you know what a cold frame is? I do. We built one. Do you want to see it? I already saw it. She looked at him. What did you think? I think you built it right. And I think starting seed 6 weeks earlier is going to change what your kitchen garden can produce. Lily absorbed this with the satisfaction of someone whose reasoning has been confirmed by an independent source. That's what I calculated too, she said, and opened the pamphlet to a page she'd marked. Caleb looked at the page. He looked at the notes in the margin, written in the careful, slightly oversized handwriting of a child who was still making her letters do what she wanted. He looked at the calculations she'd done, planting schedules, expected yield differences, frost date margins. He looked at Clara, who was watching from the stove. She looked back at him. Something in her expression was different from the morning, not resolved exactly, but moved. Shifted on its axis slightly, the way things shift when enough evidence has come in from enough directions that it's no longer possible to maintain the same position. She turned back to the stove. He stayed 3 days. He worked during those 3 days because that was what the ranch required, and because there was no natural way to be in a working place without working. He helped Thomas with the south pasture fence maintenance and found the boy had developed, over the winter, a capability with the wire tensioning that was cleaner than what he'd learned from Caleb. He told Thomas this, and Thomas said, without false modesty, that Eric Halverson had shown him a better grip technique and that it had made a difference. You should use it then, Caleb said. I already am, Thomas said, which was the Thomas version of thank you. He talked to Clara in the evenings, after the children were in bed, about the Valley program. He laid it out the way she'd taught him to lay things out. Plainly, with the complications acknowledged, the variables named, the places where it could fail as clearly marked as the places where it was working. She listened and asked questions, the sharp, specific questions of someone who knew the terrain he was talking about better than he did. She named 2 operations he hadn't contacted yet that she thought were too proud to reach out but would participate if approached correctly. She named one he had contacted that she was skeptical of, not the operation itself but the man running it, who had a pattern with neighboring properties that she'd been watching for 2 seasons. He took notes, actual notes, on paper, because what she was telling him was worth writing down. On the second evening, she said, looking at his notes, You're doing this differently than you would have done it before. Before January? Before January. Before all of it. She gestured at the notes. You're not assuming you know what people need, you're asking. I spent 4 months finding out what happens when you assume the wrong things. You spent 4 months, she said, finding out what it feels like to need something from people. That's not the same as the wrong assumptions. He looked at her. You weren't wrong about most things you did here, she said, with the careful precision she brought to things she'd thought about for a long time before saying, the fence plan, the barriers, the cattle shelter. You were right about those, but you were doing them for someone you didn't fully trust yourself to be honest with. That's the thing that went wrong, not the work." He sat with that for a moment. "Yes," he said. "The work was always real," she said. "I knew that even when I was angry." She looked at her coffee. "That made it more complicated, not less." He understood what she meant. It would have been easier if he'd been wrong about the fence, or wrong about the barriers, or wrong about any of the things he'd said would work. Being right had made it impossible for her to simply dismiss the 4 months, which meant she'd had to live with the complicated version. The version where someone had genuinely helped her and genuinely misled her at the same time, and both of those things were equally true. He'd lived with that version too, from the other side. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "Would you have let me help if you'd known who I was? In January, if I told you from the beginning?" She considered this for a long time. He'd learned to let her consider things for as long as she needed. "I don't know," she said finally. "Maybe not. Maybe I would have been too careful, too aware of what you could do and what I couldn't." She paused. "The help might have been different, less like working with someone and more like being helped by someone." "Yes," he said. "Which is worse," she said, "in case that's not clear." "It's clear." She looked at the window. "I'm not saying it was worth it, what you did. I'm saying the answer to your question is I don't know, and I'm choosing to be honest about that rather than say something definitive that I haven't actually figured out yet." "That's enough," he said. "It's all I've got right now," she said. On the third morning, Ruth Adler arrived, as Ruth Adler tended to arrive, without formal notice, with a jar of something in her hand and opinions in her eyes. She looked at Caleb at the kitchen table and at Clara at the stove, and at the particular quality of the air between them, which had changed from January in ways that Ruth, who had been reading rooms for 50-some years, read instantly and said nothing about. Instead, she set her jar on the table and said to Caleb, "I heard about the shelter program. Ortega told me about it. She said you sat down with her at your table and answered her questions until she was satisfied. She had good questions. She does. She's been in this valley 30 years, and she's not easy to satisfy." Ruth sat down. "You should come to the spring meeting. The Valley families get together at the Halverson place in May. It'd be a good time to talk about the program with people in a room instead of one at a time." Caleb looked at Clara. Clara looked at him. "Ruth's been trying to organize that meeting for 3 years, she said. Nobody's come with anything worth meeting about yet." "I'll come," Caleb said. Ruth smiled the smile of a woman who has been patient about something for a long time and is feeling the patience pay out. "Good. I'll tell Halverson to set enough chairs." She stayed for coffee and left before noon, and Caleb packed his things and saddled Scratch, while Thomas did the afternoon chores and Lily stood near the barn door in a way that was not quite watching and was also entirely watching. "You'll come back for the meeting," Lily said. "The Halverson meeting." "Yes." "And after that?" He looked at her. 8 years old and asking the question everyone else was being careful not to ask yet. "I don't know yet, Lily." She looked at him with the expression that he suspected she'd still have at 40. The same quality of direct, unhurried appraisal. "You're better at not knowing than you used to be," she said. He thought about this. "How do you mean?" "Before, when you said you didn't know, it sounded like you were saying it because you weren't sure you were allowed to know. Now it sounds like you're saying it because you actually don't know yet." She considered this. "That's better." He stood at the barn door looking at her for a moment. "You're going to terrify people, Lily, when you're grown." "I know," she said, without concern. Clara came out of the house as he was mounting. She stood in the yard and looked up at him, one hand shading her eyes against the spring light. "The program meeting in May," she said. "I'll come." "I know you will." "Not because of you," she said, "because it's a good program, and those families need it, and Ruth's been trying to get people in a room for 3 years." "I know that too." She looked at him. The spring light was different from the January light, warmer, more forgiving, though the yard still had mud in it, and the fence still needed checking, and the work was still the work, regardless of what season it was. "You said you left to find out if there was anything left of you," she said. "When you took everything away." "Yes." "Was there?" He looked at her, at this woman who had pulled him off a frozen hillside and fed him and worked beside him, and been honest with him about what he'd failed to be for her, and who was standing in her muddy yard in the spring light, asking him a real question and waiting for a real answer.
"There was less than I hoped," he said, "and more than I feared, and most of what was actually there, I only found it here." Clara looked at him for a moment. She didn't soften. She was not a woman who softened on schedule, but something in her face settled. The way ground settles after a long winter, not into something new, but into itself. "Safe ride north," she said. "I'll see you in May," he said. He rode out of the yard and took the long road, the one that went past the south pasture and the fence line, and he looked at it as he passed. The posts set deep, the wire clean and tensioned, the marker notches visible at the intervals where winter had done its worst. He rode past all of it and on to the road north, and the valley opened out around him with its spring mud and its beginning green and its slow, unglamorous return to the business of growing things. He thought about what Clara had said. Most men either hide what they have or put it out front. He thought about how long he'd spent doing neither of those things cleanly, hiding himself behind the wealth so thoroughly that he'd stopped knowing where the wealth ended, and he began, and then running from it so completely that he'd nearly lost himself in the running, what he understood now. And it was not a dramatic understanding, not the kind that arrives with force and changes everything in an instant, but the kind that settles in over months of work and cold and difficulty, and watching how other people hold their lives together, was that there was no position far enough from his money and his land that he could stand in and find his true self waiting. There was no experiment that would reveal the essential Caleb Whitmore. There was only what he did day after day, with what he had, for the people in front of him. That was all anyone had. It was what Clara had. It was what Thomas had, with his knife and his fence posts and his deliberate, careful competence. It was what Lily had, with her cold frame and her margins full of calculations, and her unblinking certainty about things that were still becoming true. You were not the sum of what you owned, but you were also not the sum of what you'd given away or walked away from. You were what you built, and what you kept, and what you showed up to do when there was no audience and no reward, and the ground was frozen and the cattle were in trouble, and someone needed the rope held while they made it down the slope. He'd been that person, or had learned to be, in Clara Bennett's barn in a frozen valley in the winter of 1887. Whether he could be it in his own life, on his own land, with all the weight of what he owned around him, that was the thing he was still working on, still proving. The May meeting at the Halverson place had 14 families in attendance, which was more than Ruth Adler had dared hope for, and more than the Halverson kitchen could comfortably hold, so they ended up in the barn with the big doors open to the spring air and 2 borrowed tables pushed together in the center. Ruth presided over the whole thing with the authority of a woman who has been waiting for this specific meeting her entire adult life. Eric Halverson brought chairs from the house until there were none left, and people sat on fence rails and hay bales and nobody complained. Caleb presented the program without presenting himself. He stood up and talked about the practical structure of it, the shared supply caches, the pre-winter preparation checklist, the communication system for emergencies, and then he sat down, because the point was the program and not him. The questions came fast, and some of them were skeptical, and he answered the skeptical ones more carefully than the easy ones, because those were the questions that mattered. Clara did not speak during the formal part. She sat on a hay bale near the wall and listened and watched. And when a woman named Price asked a sharp question about what happened if a family took from the shared supply and didn't contribute back, it was Clara who answered. Not Caleb, because Clara knew the Valley families, and Clara knew what an answer needed to say and what it needed to leave unsaid to be heard correctly. Price listened, nodded, sat back. Caleb watched Clara from across the barn and thought, she's been doing this for years. All of this, the coalition building, the resource management, the reading of what people need and what they're afraid of. She's been doing it without a room to do it in. After the meeting, standing in the Halverson yard in the last of the afternoon light, Gideon Cross found Caleb. He looked older than January. Or perhaps Caleb was simply better at reading faces now. Cross had the expression of a man who has held a position for a long time and has recently begun to look at its foundations. That shelter modification, Cross said, the angle adjustment, I heard about it after the January storm. Lost 2 structures on my operation that night. My foreman said the Barrett place, which is half my size, didn't lose anything. The Barrett place used the same principle, Caleb said. They worked it out themselves, independently. Cross looked at him. You showed them?
Clara Bennett showed me. I passed it on. Cross was quiet for a moment. He looked at the barn behind them, where some of the families were still talking, the meeting dissolving slowly into the particular social warmth of people who have just decided something together and don't want to lose the feeling yet. I'm not in the habit of saying I got things wrong, he said. I know. But these small operations, he stopped, started again. They're more resilient than I gave them credit for when they're properly prepared. Yes, Caleb said, the program you're running. Yes. I'd like to know more about it. He said it in the way of a man who has decided to say something and is going to say it without dressing it up. Not to take it over, just to understand what's working. Caleb looked at him. Come to the fall meeting, he said. Bring your foreman. Let him ask the questions. He'll know which ones matter. Cross looked at him for a moment. Something in the older man's expression shifted. Not into warmth, not into anything that erased 2 years of trying to buy out Clara's South 40, but into the acknowledgement of a man who understands he is looking at something that has changed the conversation he thought he was in. All right, he said, and walked back to his horse. Clara appeared at Caleb's shoulder. She had seen the conversation from across the yard. That's new, she said. People change, Caleb said. Some of them. She looked at Cross's retreating back. Usually when something shows them a better way to be right. Maybe that's enough. Maybe. She looked at the barn, at the families still gathered. 14 families, she said. Ruth's very pleased with herself. She should be. She made this happen. You made this possible, Clara said. There's a difference. He looked at her. She was looking at the gathering, not at him, but the statement had been precise and deliberate. The kind she made when she had arrived at something after considerable thought and had decided to say it plainly. I've been thinking, she said, about what you asked me. Whether I would have let you help if I'd known. He waited. I figured out the answer, she said. It's yes. I would have. She paused. It would have been harder. I would have been watching for what you wanted from it. I would have taken longer to trust the work was real. But yes. She looked at him now. I would have let you help. Because the land needed it, and I needed it, and I'm practical enough to know that. And now? Now I know the work was real, and I know why you didn't tell me, and I know it was wrong, but I also know that you know that, and that's... She stopped. That's a different kind of knowing than I had in January. The spring evening was coming in across the valley, the light going golden and long, the way spring light does when it's finally earned its length after the short days of winter. Around them, the families of Dunmore's flat were saying their goodbyes, making plans, carrying the momentum of a meeting that had meant something out into the evening with them. I'm not asking you for anything today, Caleb said. I want you to know that. I know you're not. But I want to keep coming back, if that's all right. Clara looked at him for a moment. This woman who had survived 2 winters alone, who had built a cold frame with her daughter and reset fence posts with her son and kept a ledger balanced on the edge of possible, who had pulled a stranger off a frozen hillside because she knew what she was looking at. This woman who had been right about the shelter angle and right about the barrier placement and right about what trust required and right, in the end, about the fact that the work was real. You're not the man I found in the snow, she said. You're not that man, and you're not the man you left behind either. You're something in between that I don't have a word for yet. I don't have one either, he said. That's all right, she said. Some things take a while to name. She turned and went to say goodbye to Ruth Adler, who was organizing the return of borrowed chairs with the satisfied efficiency of a woman whose patience has been fully rewarded. Caleb stood in the Halverson yard in the spring evening and looked at the valley around him, at the land that was neither his nor not his, at the people who were neither his family nor strangers, at the work that was neither finished nor ever going to be. He had left a fortune to find out what was left of him. He had found the answer in stages, in the cold, in a kitchen that wasn't his, in the company of a woman who didn't flatter him, and 2 children who didn't defer to him, and a community of people who only cared what he could do and whether he'd show up to do it. What was left of him, when everything else was gone, was less impressive than he'd hoped and more durable than he'd feared. It was the part that could learn a fence post technique from a 12-year-old and say so. The part that could sit with a 4-column ledger in a cold kitchen and work a problem honestly until the numbers came out right. The part that had lain on a frozen hillside and waited to be found, and had been found, and had understood what it meant to be found. He had not fixed himself. He was not a better man in the clean, completed sense. He was a man who had been cracked open by a hard winter and had put himself back together with different material, and the seams showed, and that was probably as it should be. He walked across the yard to where Scratch was tied, and the old horse turned and looked at him with 16 years of experience in his eyes and no interest in philosophizing. Caleb untied him and mounted and waited for Clara, who was finishing her conversation with Ruth. She came across the yard and mounted her own horse and looked at him. "You know the road south by now," she said. "I know it," he said. They rode out of the Halverson yard together into the last of the spring light, on roads they both knew by different kinds of knowing, toward a valley that asked nothing more from any of them than what they were willing to give. On the frontier, Caleb Whitmore had once thought that a man was measured by what he owned. He had learned, in the cold and the work, and the honest accounting of a ledger that didn't lie, that a man was measured by something harder to quantify and harder to fake. Whether the people beside him, at the end of a hard winter, were glad he'd been there. He had started to earn that. He intended to keep earning it, one fence post, one conversation, one honest answer at a time.